The warrant was sitting on the desk. Every deputy in that office had already seen it. Nobody had touched it. One man had read the name at the top, set it back down, and walked out of the room without saying a word. Another had found something urgent to attend to on the other side of the building. A third was staring at his boots like they contained the answers to questions he didn't want to ask. This was Indian Territory, 1902. These were men who had ridden into ambushes, men who had tracked murderers through freezing river crossings at midnight, men who were not, by any definition, afraid of paper. But nobody was touching that warrant, because the name at the top wasn't a stranger's. It was Bennie Reeves, Bass's son. And every deputy in that room knew that this warrant wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a question, the kind of question that could unmake a legend or prove one, depending on the answer. Nobody, that is, except the one man who had built his entire life around the idea that this moment, exactly this moment, could never be someone else's job. The door opened. Bass Reeves walked in, 64 years old, 30 years of the frontier written into every line of his face. He looked at the room. He looked at the desk. He walked over, picked up the warrant, and read the name. He didn't say anything. He folded it once, slipped it into his coat pocket, and walked back out. Nobody argued. Nobody followed. Nobody said a word. What happened next didn't just define Bass Reeves' career. It sent a message across Indian Territory that outlaws would repeat in whispers for the next generation. And the reason history buried this story for over 100 years isn't because Bass failed. It's because he didn't. To understand what Bass Reeves did in 1902, you have to understand the world he operated in. Indian Territory, roughly 70,000 square miles of raw, unforgiving frontier, the land that would eventually become the state of Oklahoma. In the late 1800s, it was the most lawless stretch of land on the North American continent. No state laws, no local police, no courts worthy of the name, just federal jurisdiction, operated out of Fort Smith, Arkansas, under the authority of one man, Judge Isaac Parker, the man history would call the hanging judge. Outlaws understood that geography better than anyone. Indian Territory was a sanctuary. You crossed that line, you vanished. Murderers, thieves, bootleggers, fugitives from every state in the Union, they all flooded in, because they knew that going in after them meant maybe not coming back out. By 1875, Judge Parker had a problem. He had jurisdiction over 70,000 square miles of chaos, a courthouse, and a gallows. What he didn't have was enough men willing to go in and drag those outlaws out. In his early years on the bench, Parker lost deputies at a rate that made recruitment nearly impossible. Being a federal marshal in Indian Territory wasn't a career, it was a death sentence with a badge attached. Parker needed someone different, someone the outlaws didn't know, someone who understood that territory, its trails, its languages, its people, better than the outlaws themselves. He found Bass Reeves. Bass Reeves was 38 years old when he pinned on that badge. Born into slavery in Arkansas in 1838, he had escaped during the Civil War, slipping away from his enslaver, a Confederate officer, sometime around 1863, and spent years living among the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole nations in Indian Territory. Those years changed him permanently. He learned the land, learned several native languages, learned how to move through that wilderness like it was his own backyard, because for nearly a decade it was. He also learned to shoot, and here is where history gets almost mythological, because the accounts of Bass Reeves and firearms are almost impossible to believe until you look at the record. Bass was left-handed. He shot with his left hand, and witnesses, lawmen, outlaws, civilians alike, consistently reported a speed and accuracy that seemed physically impossible for a man of any era. Judge Parker didn't hesitate. In 1875, Bass Reeves became one of the first black men west of the Mississippi River ever commissioned as a federal marshal, in a country that had ended slavery only 10 years earlier, in a territory full of men who would happily put a bullet in him for the color of his skin alone. Bass didn't flinch. Over the next 3 decades, Bass Reeves built a record that no lawman in American history has ever matched. More than 3,000 arrests, 14 fugitives shot in self-defense, and in all those years, across all those dangerous miles, not one prisoner ever escaped his custody. Not one. But numbers don't tell you who Bass Reeves was. What tells you who Bass Reeves was is what he did with a single piece of paper on a cold morning in 1902. By 1902, the territory was changing, but Bass Reeves wasn't. Statehood was 5 years away, federal law was tightening its grip, and Bass, now 64 years old, was still wearing the badge. He had outlasted judges, governors, and 3 generations of outlaws. He'd survived ambushes, assassination attempts, and a murder charge against himself, a charge that went to trial in 1887 and ended in full acquittal. Bass Reeves didn't just survive the system, he was the system. His name alone was enough to make men surrender. There are documented accounts of outlaws, armed, dangerous men who had killed multiple times, who, upon hearing that Bass Reeves was carrying their warrant, laid down their weapons and waited, because they knew that Bass would find them eventually, and that being brought in alive was the better outcome. In 30 years, Bass had arrested black men and white men, native men and white outlaws, men who called him names that cannot be repeated, men who spat at him, threatened him, told him his badge meant nothing because of what he was. Bass always delivered them to court, every single time. Now, in the fall of 1902, a warrant arrived that nobody in the Marshal's office wanted to touch. Bennie Reeves, Bass's son. Bennie had grown up in the shadow of a legend. His father gone for months at a time, riding across a territory full of men who wanted him dead. Growing up the son of Bass Reeves meant growing up with something to live up to that most men couldn't reach in 10 lifetimes, and knowing that the man most responsible for your upbringing was almost never home. Somewhere along the way, Bennie had gone terribly wrong. His wife's name was Costella. By the accounts that survive, the argument between them was violent, sudden, and final. In a moment of rage, Bennie Reeves killed her. Costella Reeves was gone, and the warrant for her killer was sitting on a desk in the Marshal's office with no one willing to pick it up. Here is what you need to understand about that moment. This wasn't bureaucratic cowardice. The deputies who looked away from that warrant were not weak men. They were experienced lawmen who understood exactly what they were looking at and exactly what it would mean to be the man who served it. Nobody wanted to be the one who arrested Bass Reeves's son, and nobody wanted to be the one who told Bass Reeves that someone else had done it. So when Bass walked in, read the room, took that warrant off the desk and walked back out, every man in that room understood what had just happened. He hadn't been assigned it, he hadn't been ordered, he hadn't been asked. He had claimed it, the way Bass Reeves claimed everything, quietly, completely, and without leaving room for discussion. Word traveled fast in Indian Territory. It always had. By the time Bass was saddling his horse, people already knew. The telegraph carried it first. Word of mouth carried it faster. Bass Reeves had taken the warrant for his own son and had gone out to serve it himself. The reaction told you everything about the territory's relationship with Bass Reeves. Some men, Outlaws who had been watching Bass for years, looking for any crack in the armor, said this would be the moment. That a man could only be so strong, that blood was blood, and sooner or later, blood won. They wanted to believe that Bass Reeves was, in the end, just a man with a man's weaknesses. They had wanted to believe that for 30 years. They had never been right yet. The men who had ridden with Bass, who had watched him work up close, who understood what he actually was, said nothing. They already knew what was going to happen. They'd seen Bass deliver men he liked, men he respected, men who had done him personal favors. Bass Reeves did not do favorites. Back home, Bass's wife Winnie watched him prepare to ride out. She had been married to Bass Reeves for decades. She understood something that very few people grasped from the outside. The badge wasn't something Bass wore, it was something Bass was. She was losing her son that day too. She understood that. The grief of it was real, and it was hers to carry, and she would carry it. But she watched Bass ride out without a word, because she had married a man who believed in something bigger than either of them, and asking him to stop now would mean asking him to stop being himself. Bass Reeves was not built for that. The territory waited. Bennie Reeves was not sitting at home waiting to be found. After what he had done to Castella, he had run into the Badlands, the deep, tangled stretches of Indian territory where men who didn't want to be found disappeared for months. It was the same geography that had sheltered outlaws for 30 years, the same wilderness that had swallowed fugitives whole. Bennie knew the territory too. He was Bass Reeves' son, after all. But here is the thing about being the son of the greatest tracker in the American frontier. You can run into the same wilderness your father taught the world to fear. You can follow every rule, stay off the main trails, cross the water to break the scent, keep moving at night. It doesn't matter, because Bass Reeves wasn't tracking a stranger. He was tracking someone he had watched take his first steps. Bass rode into the Badlands alone. He didn't need a posse. In 30 years, he had tracked men through worse country than this, through blizzards and floods, through terrain that horses refused to cross. He had walked into outlaw camps under false names, wearing borrowed clothes, carrying cover stories layered 3 deep. He had eaten dinner with men who had warrants on their heads, slept under their roofs, and woken them up with iron on their wrists. This time, he carried no disguise. No false name, no cover story, no performance, just the badge, the warrant, and the truth of what he was going to do. A father, a lawman, a man with no mask left to put on. The tracking took days, a broken branch at the wrong angle, a cold fire circle, ash still holding the shape of a windbreak built by someone who knew what they were doing. Hoofprints in creek mud, the gait slightly familiar, a favored stride Bass had watched since the boy was 14 years old. Every piece of evidence was a piece of a person Bass knew better than almost anyone on earth. Think about what that means. Every skill Bass had spent 30 years perfecting, the reading of terrain, the interpretation of physical evidence, the understanding of how a man moves when he's afraid, was now pointed at his own child. The hunter and the hunted were connected by something no warrant could name. On the 3rd or 4th day, accounts vary, Bass found him. Bennie saw his father coming from a distance, and in that moment, whatever he had been telling himself for the days he had been running, it stopped, because you could run from Bass Reeves the Marshal. You couldn't run from the man who had taught you how to saddle a horse. He knew better than to try. Bennie stopped, waited. Bass rode up, stopped his horse. Father and son looked at each other across a stretch of ground that felt about 1,000 miles wide. There was no speech, no courtroom monologue, no dramatic recitation of sins. Bass reached into his coat, took out the warrant, held it up so Bennie could see the name on it. Then he said, "Bennie, you know what this is. Mount up." That was it. No rage, no tears, no extra weight on the words, just the law, delivered by the one man in the territory who had never once let it mean less than everything. Bennie mounted up. Bass reached out and took his son's hands, the same wrists he had once wrapped when the boy was small enough to carry, the same hands he had taught to hold a rope, to grip a saddle, to do the 100 small things a man learns from his father. The iron went on. Bass didn't look away, and he rode his son back to face justice for what he had done to Castella. Bass Reeves rode into Muskogee with his son in custody. Muskogee was one of the largest cities in Indian Territory by 1902, a real city, businesses, newspapers, a federal courthouse, a place where everyone knew Bass Reeves by name and reputation. When they came down the main street, the town stopped. Not the polite pause of recognition, a full, complete stop. Men, mid-conversation, let their words die. Women turned from what they were doing and stood still. Children who had been running went quiet without knowing why, only sensing that whatever was happening in the street was something their parents would talk about for years. Because what they were seeing had no category. A father, his son, the badge, the iron. Bass Reeves, the man who had delivered more than 3,000 criminals to justice, the man whose name outlaws whispered like a weather warning, was riding into town with his own child in custody. And Bass was not broken. He was not weeping. He was not performing the weight of his sacrifice for anyone watching. He was straight-backed, stone-faced, and moving at the same unhurried pace he always moved at, because this was the job, and Bass Reeves did the job. Those who were there that day left accounts that passed through the territory for years afterward. One described it simply, that Bass did not look like a man who was suffering. He looked like a man who had decided a long time ago that he would never be the reason the law meant nothing, and was keeping that promise, even now, even at this price. Bennie was delivered to stand trial for what he had done to Castella. Bass filed the paperwork, signed the transfer documents, did everything the job required. And then, by every account that survives, he went home and didn't speak of it again. His family knew. The men who rode with him knew. There was a weight on Bass Reeves after 1902 that hadn't been there before. He was still sharp, still effective, still the most formidable lawman in the territory. But something had been paid that could not be refunded. Word spread to every outlaw camp, every hideout, every man who had ever thought about running from Bass Reeves, and the message wasn't complicated. If Bass Reeves put iron on his own son, the boy he raised, the blood he shares, what exactly do you think he's going to do to you? A man who will not make an exception for his own child will not make one for anyone. There was no relationship that gave you cover, no plea that would move him, no calculation that changed the math. Bass Reeves had proven it in the most personal terms imaginable, and the territory understood. His name, which had always meant danger, now meant something else entirely. It meant inevitability. Here is the part of this story that history nearly lost entirely. Bennie Reeves was sent to the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas. He went in as a man who had done an unforgivable thing. And inside those walls, something happened that nobody who watched Bass ride into Muskogee that day could have predicted. Bennie became a model prisoner. He served his time without incident, without complaint, without the bitterness that swallows most men who end up in a place like Leavenworth. He was paroled. He came out, and he built a life, a quiet, decent life, the kind of life that his mother and father had always wanted for him. Bass Reeves lived long enough to see it. Think about what that means. Think about what Bass had bet on that day in the Badlands when he put iron on his son's wrists. He hadn't just enforced the law, he had made a wager that a system he believed in, a system that had enslaved him, a system that had failed Black Americans at every possible turn, could still do what it was supposed to do, could still, in some cases, reach a man and bring him back. For Bennie Reeves, it did. Whether Bass lived to see his son walk free, history doesn't say with certainty. What history does say is that Bennie Reeves came out a different man. And somewhere in that fact, whether Bass knew it or not, is the answer to every question about why he made the ride he made. The greatest lawman in the history of the American frontier put his own son in prison, and his own son came back a better man. That is not a tragedy. That is the whole point. Bass Reeves retired from the U.S. Marshals in 1907, when Indian Territory was absorbed into the newly formed state of Oklahoma and the federal marshal system was restructured. He didn't stop working. He became a city policeman in Muskogee at 69 years old, because sitting still was not in his design. He served until his health finally failed. He died on January 12, 1910. He was 71 years old. The newspapers covered his death. Some called him a remarkable officer. A few acknowledged he had spent his early years enslaved. None of them gave him what he deserved. Because what Bass Reeves represented wasn't just competence, it wasn't bravery or skill or endurance, though he had all three in quantities that defy belief. What Bass Reeves represented was a single radical idea, that justice is not a flexible concept, that the law, applied without exception, is the only version of the law that actually means anything. In the era Bass Reeves lived in, that idea was genuinely revolutionary. Post-Civil War America applied the law differently based on race, openly, routinely, without apology. White men walked free for crimes that would hang black men. The badge Bass wore had been designed in most of the country to protect white property and white power. Bass Reeves took that badge and made it mean something different, not through speeches, not through protest, through 30 years of showing up, doing the work, and refusing every single time without exception to make exceptions, even when the exception would have been his own son. Now let me tell you the final piece of this story. In 1933, a radio program premiered that became one of the most beloved entertainment properties in American history. A masked lawman, a native companion, a frontier jurisdiction, disguises, a code of absolute justice so unbreakable that outlaws surrendered at the sound of his name, a legend. The Lone Ranger. The creators said it was fiction, an original American archetype born from imagination. But historians and Bass Reeves's own descendants have documented the parallels in detail. Every defining element of that character maps, point by point, onto the life of a black man born into slavery in Arkansas, who had no reason to believe the law would ever protect him. They took his story, changed his face, called it fiction. Bass Reeves was not fiction. He was the most decorated federal marshal in the history of the American frontier, a man who memorized warrants because he had never been allowed to learn to read, a man who learned several native languages in the wilderness after escaping slavery, a man who arrested more than 3,000 criminals and never lost one, a man who tracked his own son through the Badlands of Indian Territory, put iron on his wrists, rode him back to Muskogee, and filed the paperwork. Because that was the job, and Bass Reeves did the job. He didn't do it for recognition. He didn't do it because the system deserved his loyalty. The system had enslaved him. He did it because he believed with everything he was that a world governed by impartial law was better than the alternative. and he was willing to pay any price to prove that belief was real, even the highest price a father can pay. Bass Reeves didn't ask history to remember him. He didn't need to. He just did the work, every single day across 30 years of the most dangerous frontier this country ever produced, until there was nothing left to do. That's not a legacy worth remembering. That's a legacy that remembers itself. If this story hit different, if Bass Reeves made you feel something real, hit that like button right now. Not for the algorithm, for Bass. Because this man spent his whole life doing the right thing, and history barely gave him a footnote. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. True stories, Black history, Western history, American history that actually happened, the parts they left out of the textbooks. Drop a comment. I want to know one thing. Could you have done what Bass did? Where is the line between a father and a lawman? Tell me. Turn on notifications, because next up is the story of how Bass disguised himself as a broke farmer, walked into an outlaw hideout, ate dinner with the men who had warrants on their heads, slept under their roof, and woke them up in iron. The legend continues. Stay with us.